Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. We'll be analyzing 5 newspaper articles today. The handouts for the same will be available in the description of this video. The first article will be the nuclear policy of India. We'll be analyzing that. The second article is regarding the bad loans. We'll be discussing the NPAs, non-performing assets, and the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The third article is related to the ethanol blending in petrol. The fourth article is regarding clean coal, that is usage of ammonia along with coal that Japan is trying to use to lower the emissions. And the final article is regarding the application of stem cell transplant as a cure for HIV. Now the first article, the South Asia Nuclear Zero. This is important in GS3 as achievements of Indians in science and technology and indigenization of technology, and also in GS paper 2. Now, India started developing nuclear weapons long back. 25 years have passed since Pokhran 2 also. Let's look at the backdrop first in which India started developing nuclear capabilities. China was conducting a series of nuclear tests in the 1960s. Therefore, the UN Security Council came up with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the goals of which are non-proliferation, disarmament, and the right to peacefully use nuclear technology. But this NPT is discriminatory as it legitimized the monopoly of the P5 members over the nuclear technology, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. Therefore, India conducted peaceful nuclear explosions in 1974, sanctioned by the Indira Gandhi regime. Even after that, we kept on developing nuclear capabilities and we conducted tests again in 1998, after which Shri Vajpayee announced that India is a nuclear state after the Pokhran 2 tests. Now we had to develop this because we are living in a nuclearized neighborhood and there was a progressively constraining non-proliferation environment. Therefore, after the tests, India came up with the draft nuclear policy also, because we wanted to convey to the world that India does not have any malicious intentions. We are not going to launch a nuclear war with anyone. Now, what does this draft nuclear policy say? It says that there will be no first use. We'll be using nuclear weapons only in retaliation if somebody is using nuclear weapons upon India. Even Article 51 of the UN Charter grants individual members, nations of the countries of the world, the power to retaliate, to ensure that they have the collective and individual self-defense if they are attacked upon, the Article 51 of the UN Charter. Now, we want to have a deterrence only. Now, this deterrence will not be against conventional weapons. For example, even after the development of nuclear capabilities, we fought the Kargil War also in 1999. There have been continuous territorial ingressions made by China. There is pumping of cross-border terrorists by Pakistan into India. But we have not used nuclear because that deterrence that we have because of the nuclear capabilities, it is not against conventional warfare. And we want to ensure that it is only at a credible minimum level only. We are not going to enter into a nuclear arms race as it will be very costly. Now, ensuring a credible minimum deterrence in South Asia will be easy actually, because the population density in South Asia, it is high. And even if we have low accuracy delivery vehicles, we can cause unacceptable damage in retaliation. Again, no first use here also. Also, we have a national security objective. What is that? A global, verifiable and non-discriminatory disarmament, plus the control of the usage of nuclear weapons that lies with the civilian authorities in India. For example, there is a political council which is headed by the PM who will ultimately decide whether to use or not to use nuclear weapons. Then there is the executive council headed by the NSA. After that, the strategic forces command comes into picture. So there won't be any multiple power centers. The control of the nuclear weapons lies with the civilian authority only. And we want to ensure that there is massive retaliation also which causes unacceptable damage, that only will ensure that there is a credible minimum deterrence. Now the key themes here are credible minimum deterrence and the no first use. Now why no first use? Because it will avoid provocative signals, provocative triggers to other countries, for example particularly to China maybe. Then it will ensure that we are not entering into any arms race, and it will in future ensure that we may get the membership of NSG also, UNSC also. Although for NSG we have already gotten a waiver, but in future it ensures that Indian credentials of a peaceful nation, they are maintained, and we are a responsible power, and disarmament remains our goal in the national security objective too. And it will ensure the regional balance, particularly in our neighborhood region. Now, there are certain arguments against no first use also. For example, some quarters say that it can serve like an antidote to the alleged conventional inferiority. Now, but if we use nuclear weapons to counter our alleged conventional inferiority, it may lead to fears of escalation, for example, with China. And it restricts our military options also, and it has been rejected by the nuclear states. But ultimately, security is a dynamic concept. And India's experience with the nuclear capabilities has been one of a period of restraint, maturity, and responsibility. India has behaved maturely. What we should do along with these capabilities is we should focus upon developing the conventional military capabilities, because we should be able to resort to cold start doctrine also, to defensive offense also. We should be able to use military as well as intelligence. For example, in the words of Doval, if you do another Mumbai, you will lose Balochistan. And particularly when we look at the South Asian geopolitical riddle, we need both an acerbic brilliance of a Chanakya as well as the demure yet powerful techniques of a Narasimha Rao. The next article is regarding the bad loans. As per an RBI report, banks have written off large amount of bad loans during the last few years. This is important in paper 3 in Indian economy and the issues related to planning and mobilization of resources. Now this article has given quite a bit of data. Let's look at the data first before going into the background and understanding the concepts as well as the solutions that we'll be talking about. What does this data say? There have been write-offs. In the last 1 year, about 2 lakh crore worth of loans have been written off. In the last 5 years, about 10 lakh crore loans have been written off. And in the last 10 years, about 15 lakh crore worth of loans have been written off. And most of these write-offs have come through the PSBs, the public sector banks, which account for almost 2/3, more than 60% of the write-offs. And this has ensured that the gross NPAs, the gross non-performing assets, they are at a 10-year low right now, about 3.9%. Although if we include the write-offs also, then the NPAs would have been about 7.5%, almost the double of the present figures. And these NPAs, if we look in terms of numbers, they have come down from 10 lakh crore to about 5 lakh crore in the last 5 years. But most of it is due to write-offs. Recoveries have been pretty poor, that we'll see. When we look at the recovery numbers, in the last 3 years, about less than 20% of the write-offs have been recovered actually. Now let's look at the background also, a few things. When the interest or the principal amount that is due on a loan becomes overdue for 90 days, it is termed as a non-performing asset. Now, when the amount remains due for a long period of time, then banks think that there is very low chance of recovery and funds are stuck here, and they try to write off that loan. After that loan is written off, that amount of write-off is reduced from the profit of the bank, and therefore the tax liability of the bank comes down. It also cleans the balance sheet of the bank, which shows that there is a healthy credit flow. Because for the loans, banks also have to ensure that they are adhering to the provisioning norms, and thus the amount, the funds which are stuck in the system, they are circulating again. Therefore, banks try to write off the bad loans. Now, writing off that loan does not mean that the bank will not try to recover it in the future. The loan will remain in the books of the bank as unrecovered loans. Now, there are certain technical write-offs are essentially to ensure that there is a cleansing of the bank's balance sheet, and also it is to ensure that there is taxation efficiency which is achieved and tax liability of the bank comes down. Now for this, RBI has given guidelines from time to time regarding the policy for the loan recoveries. A few of them are here, like the manner of recovery of the dues that has to be taken into account while determining whether to write off the loan or not, and the targeted level of reduction, the norms for permitted sacrifice or waiver, etc., the factors which need to be taken into account before the actual write-off, the decision levels, the people who are making the decision to write off or to waive off that loan, at what level of management they are at, and the reporting to higher authorities and the monitoring of write-offs and waiver cases. These factors have to be taken into account as per the RBI guidelines when loans are written off. Now there are concerns that there may be possibilities of wrongdoings when the loans are written off here, because at times there are willful defaulters also, there are shady promoters also, and if loans are written off in this manner where there is no policy for the write-off of the loan and the procedure of write-off that is non-transparent, then it may lead to loss to the public exchequer, because that money which is being written off ultimately that impacts the taxpayer, and therefore this might lead to a cheating of the public exchequer also. Now, what are the solutions for this? Earlier there used to be, for the corporate insolvency we'll be talking about, the corporate bad loans we'll be focusing upon today. Earlier there used to be SARFAESI, the Lok Adalats and the debt recovery tribunals, but they were not hugely successful. Therefore, in 2016, the government came up with a comprehensive insolvency and bankruptcy code. Now, under the insolvency and bankruptcy code, when an insolvency is triggered, when a corporate insolvency is triggered, there can be two outcomes. Either the company will be liquidated or the company will be resolved. There will be a resolution. That resolution can be in the form of a merger, demerger, acquisition by a new party, change of ownership, etc. Or there may be that kind of resolution. Now let's look at the process under the IBC also first, how the corporate insolvency is taking place. Under this, whenever a corporate debtor is defaulting, either party, whether it is the debtor or the creditor, they can apply for the corporate insolvency resolution process under section 6 of the IPC. Now, provided that the minimum amount of default here should be at least 1 crore. After that only any party can approach. Now they can approach the NCLT benches, the National Company Law Tribunal, and the tribunal will have 14 days to admit or reject the application. Earlier there used to be 180 days deadline to complete this insolvency resolution process, and there were 90 days extension which could also be given. But the latest amended mandatory deadline to complete this insolvency resolution process is now 330 days. Now what happens here is, first an interim resolution professional is appointed. Now this interim resolution professional takes control of the assets and the operations of the defaulter, and he coordinates the constitution of a committee of creditors. This committee of creditors will decide the viability of the company, whether this company is viable to operate further or it should be liquidated, whether it can be operated after restructuring in future, and this committee of creditors will appoint an insolvency professional. This insolvency professional can be the same person who was the interim resolution professional, or he can be a different person also. Now this insolvency professional will examine the proposals for the resolution plan. The resolution plans can be proposing restructuring, merger, demerger, acquisition, etc. And these eligible plans are submitted to the committee of creditors. The committee of creditors examines these and approves these or rejects these. The approval of these resolution plans by the committee of creditors requires 66% of the majority of the people who are voting in the committee of the creditors. After the approval, the committee of creditors submits this resolution plan to the tribunal, and this entire process should take about 330 days, although this deadline is not being adhered to. There is one more provision for the MSMEs, the micro, small and medium enterprises. There is a provision for the pre-pack insolvency resolution process. Now, what are pre-packs? Under the pre-packs, the creditor and the debtor, they can reach an out of the court settlement also, provided that the maximum default is up to 1 crore only. Now, this procedure is fine, but there are certain challenges that we'll observe. For example, the recent IBBI data shows, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India data shows that in the last about 6 years, out of the 3400 odd cases which were submitted to the IBC, about 50% have been liquidated. Now observe that the first purpose of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is to ensure that all avenues for resolution of the company are explored. First priority is resolution. After that, it will ensure the maximization of the value of the assets of the corporate debtor. Finally, only as a last resort, the company will be liquidated. But if we look at the data in the past 6 years, about 50% of the companies which were going through the corporate insolvency resolution process were liquidated, and only about 14 to 15% of the companies achieved proper resolution. Even after that, if we look at the percentage of the debt that is recovered, that is abysmally low. For example, if the banks are taking almost 90 to 95% haircut of the total loan that is due to them, then that resolution is not a proper resolution. And if you look at the fiscal year 22 data, about 772 days were taken to complete the resolution process in case of companies which were owing more than 1000 crore as debt. And this is far exceeding the 330 days, even the amended mandatory deadline to complete this insolvency resolution process. These are some of the lacunas also in the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The third article is regarding the ethanol impetus, that the government is pushing towards more and more production of ethanol and its blending in petrol. This is important in GS3 in energy. Now, the article presents a table and a graph also. Let's look at that first, which shows how much the quantity of ethanol production has increased and how much the sources for ethanol have been diversified. If you look at the quantity, a decade ago almost about 38 crore liters of ethanol was produced, whereas if you look at the latest data, about 559 crore liters of ethanol is being produced. And when we look at the sources for ethanol, they have also been diversified. Now, before going ahead, let's talk about ethanol also. Ethanol is 99.9% pure alcohol. Now, this ethanol we want to blend with petrol by about 20% by 2025 throughout India. Initially, we used to get ethanol from the C-heavy molasses. Molasses are the byproduct. When sugarcane is crushed, the remaining fiber after taking out the syrup, the juice of sugarcane, that is left is molasses. The total fermentable sugar that can be extracted is about 13.5 to 14% of it. Out of this, 2 to 2.5% is non-recoverable, which remains in the C-heavy molasses. It contains about 40 to 45% of sugar, and when we use this C-heavy molasses, that is when maximum amount of syrup has been extracted from the sugarcane that is possible, that is feasible, then it can give about 220 to 225 liters of ethanol from 1 ton C-heavy molasses. Now, after that, the government started giving incentives, and if you observe now, from B-heavy molasses also we are extracting ethanol. That B-heavy molasses mean that extra 1.5 to 2% of total fermentable sugar content in the sugarcane is left, and that is used for ethanol production. And that gives about 300 liters of ethanol per ton of sugarcane molasses. Another can be viable option is fermenting the entire 13.5 to 14% of the total fermentable sugar into ethanol. That will produce about 80 to 81 liters of ethanol. Now we have tried to diversify the feedstock also, the raw source for ethanol also. For example, not only from the molasses from the sugarcane, we can produce ethanol from the food grains also, like broken and damaged grains or maybe surplus rice, etc. Now when we look at the ethanol yields from the different sources, 1 ton of rice, grains, etc., it produces 450 to 480 liters. So therefore the amount of ethanol that can be extracted from the grains, from the millets, that is more than the amount that we can extract from the molasses. From the millets we can get about 380 liters from 1 ton. Now this capacity to extract the ethanol from the food grains or from the molasses, it is dependent upon the starch content. But when we look at the ethanol which is extracted from the grains, that takes more time, that process is longer because that starch has to be converted into simpler sugars like sucrose, fructose, glucose, whereas that is already present in the sugarcane molasses. After converting into simpler sugars, then only fermentation takes place and it is fermented into ethanol. Now there is an incentive that the government has provided, the differential pricing. Earlier, the oil marketing companies, when they were sourcing ethanol from the ethanol producers, they were giving a uniform rate, whether it is produced from rice, grain, millets or from sugarcane molasses, it was the same rate that was being given. Now there is a different rate. More price is given to B heavy molasses, even more price is given to the sugar cane itself if it is used to extract ethanol, and that has led to the diversification of the feedstock. Therefore the surplus grain, the surplus rice which FCI has, that is also used often, and the damaged grains, they are also used often to produce ethanol. Now there is a year-round production, because earlier if only sugarcane molasses are used to produce ethanol, then the crushing season lasts from about November to April. From May to October, those facilities will be lying idle. Now there are facilities like Triveni, DCM, Shriram, etc. They are operating on multiple feedstocks and they use molasses from November to April, and after that in the off season they use food grains, excess supply of food grains, for example from FCI, etc., that is surplus, to produce ethanol. And this diversification of feedstock, this will minimize the variation in the supply fluctuations also, and it will minimize the price volatility on account of less production of any one single crop. Now this boost, because of this feedstock diversification, this has led to more quantity of ethanol being blended in petrol. For example, about a decade ago it was just about 1.6% of blending with petrol. Now about 11.75% ethanol is there in the ethanol blended petrol. Now there are new demands for grains. For example, like we say, UP is a major producer of sugarcane, Bihar produces a lot of maize, like Punjab, Haryana, MP, they are feeding India, likewise UP, Bihar, they can fuel India. Then El Nino induced monsoon uncertainties, that has led to certain uncertainties. Therefore, the government even banned the exports of wheat and non-basmati rice, etc. But still, the diversion of excess stock to ethanol production has not been cut down. Now, there are benefits of the byproduct also. For example, the liquid effluent, the spent wash we call it, the byproduct of it, that can also be used. It can be concentrated to solids and it can be used as a boiler fuel along with bagasse. And after that, the ash that is produced, that contains potash, that can be used as a fertilizer also. And when we are using grains as the raw material for producing ethanol, then their spent wash is concentrated through a centrifuge and that is used as animal feed also. Now, this article presents all the advantages of the ethanol blending, but there are certain issues also here. What are the issues with ethanol blending? One, it might impact the food security of India if food grains are diverted towards ethanol blending. Or for example, the land is used more for sowing those crops which are serving as the raw material for ethanol. Then they are using water intensive crops, for example rice, sugarcane, etc. It can be cost prohibitive also. For example, in Gen 2, there might be the production of GM crops which will use terminator seeds, etc., which will increase the cost for the farmers to produce that. And Gen 3 can even involve algae for the production of biofuels, etc. Then there is a lack of flex fuel vehicles. For example, the latest vehicles, they are capable of more ethanol being they are capable of using petrol which has more ethanol blended in it. Then the emissions, they will still remain even when ethanol is blended with petrol. The next article is regarding clean coal. This is important again in GS3 in energy. A Japanese company, JERA, has come up with an idea that we can use co-firing of ammonia along with coal in the boilers to produce energy. Let's look at the background first, why Japan is going for innovations in the production of energy using coal only, whether using new technologies for ensuring that there is green coal. Japan has huge energy needs, and after the earthquake and tsunami it led to a meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and overnight they had to shut down the nuclear power facilities, and about 30% of the nation's power immediately vanished. And this led to construction of new coal plants there. Now, since they are relatively new, they want to keep on using the coal, and also it is one of the cheapest sources of energy. But also there is a resistance against the reboot of nuclear power plants there, which the Japan PM has recently tried, but the communities which are hosting those nuclear power plants, they are resisting against the restarting of the nuclear power plants. Plus, Japan has commitments for net zero carbon emissions. They want to export the technology also, which will ensure forex earnings for them. And Japan is a country which has few of its own natural resources. It is meeting about only 11% of its energy needs through domestic sources. After that, 89% of its energy needs are met through fuel imports. When there was a meet of G7, only Japan refused to commit to the target of phasing out coal completely in the next 7 years by 2030. And in case of Japan, there are hurdles to renewable energy also. For example, it is geographically isolated. It has a mountainous terrain and deep sea waters, and there is an annual typhoon season also. Therefore, it wants to ensure that the coal power plants that it has, they will stay functional, although it is trying to cut down upon the emissions there. But this technology that they are using, the co-firing of ammonia along with coal to cut down upon the CO2 emissions, it has certain issues. What are those issues? One, it will lead to the emission of nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is toxic to human beings, and it is a potent greenhouse gas. It will lead to air pollution also. It will lead to formation of ground level ozone. It will lead to smoke, and a prolonged exposure to it will lead to respiratory problems also. Plus, the ammonia that it is trying to use in the co-firing along with the coal in the boilers, its supply has to be steady, affordable and clean supply. For the production of ammonia also, one common process uses the heating of water to very high temperatures, about 2000 degrees centigrade. After that, there is a splitting of hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and the hydrogen atoms are combined with nitrogen atoms to form ammonia. Now that also requires electricity, the production of ammonia. Plus, this will lead to a very tiny mitigation, because the electricity that will be used to produce ammonia, that is also consuming carbon. Plus, ammonia is a raw material for the production of fertilizers also, and the carbon capture cost here, that Japan is saying that it will be using green energy to produce ammonia, or it will be ensuring that the carbon emissions, even after using the green coal, they will be capturing that and storing it. They will be more prohibitive rather than using renewable energy straight away. Renewable energy using maybe like wind energy in Japan. Plus, there are allegations that there are entrenched industrial interests which are against the renewable energy suppliers. Now, why it is significant for India? For poorer nations and for developing countries, it is particularly important. It is a form of carbon imperialism, because when the developed countries, they were developing, they were using coal and other polluting means to ensure that their energy needs are met. Now they have a reasonably good standard of living and good income levels. Now they have more liability to reduce their carbon emissions rather than the developing countries. Plus, a poor nation's needs, they have to be met with an affordable source of energy, and coal is one of the cheapest sources of energy. And it is obvious that 40 to 60% of India's energy needs until 2030 will be met through coal. It is wishful thinking that renewable energy will overnight replace coal. And the technologies of carbon capture and storage, they are prohibitively expensive. We need to invest more in developing the technologies for the carbon capture and storage. For this, we need collaboration, we need investment from both the private and public sectors, and the development of such technologies which are affordable and feasible, like Japan is experimenting. That is important for India also, because India also wants to use coal for the decade to come. Then in the long term, if we see, India has behaved maturely. For example, India is aware that there are social costs of coal, and therefore we are taxing carbon also, both explicitly as well as implicitly. For example, when the oil prices fell during the times of COVID, we did not pass on those benefits to the consumers. Rather, the subsidy was withdrawn, and the prices in oil of petrol and diesel in India, they remained rather stable. Therefore, we moved from the negative price on carbon emissions, negative pricing means subsidy on carbon emissions, towards positive price on the carbon emissions, removal of subsidy. And we have an ambitious renewable program also, which we are adhering to. The next article is regarding the stem cell transplant that has been used as a cure for HIV. This is important in GS3, development in science and technology. And there was a previous year question also in 2017 on particularly stem cell therapy, what stem cell therapy is and what are its advantages over other treatments. Now, what is stem cell therapy? Stem cells are those cells, they are immature cells. They are used to repair the damaged cells. They can replace the damaged cells, and those immature cells, when they are transplanted into an affected person, they can develop into different types of specialized cells, such as blood cells, nerve cells, or muscle cells. Now, for the cure of HIV, the scientists had initially experimented with the stem cell transplant from those people who have a genetic mutation in the CCR5 gene. Now, this stem cell can be extracted from the bone marrow also, from the umbilical cord blood also, or from other sources. And the final goal is to replace the person's immune system with one that has been derived from the person who is resistant to HIV. What are the advantages of this stem cell therapy? One is it can potentially cure HIV by altogether eliminating the virus from the body, or it can reduce or eliminate the need for lifelong antiretroviral therapy, because lifelong antiretroviral drugs, they can lead to side effects also and development of drug resistance also. It will improve the quality of life, hope, optimism, survival, etc. And in future, it will lead to more insights into the mechanism of HIV infection and the immunity, and development of new strategies on the cure of HIV. Then it will contribute to the global efforts to end the HIV epidemic, and this research will have applications for the development of the cure of other diseases too. Now, this stem cell transplant, this still remains an experimental and a risky procedure, because a suitable donor has to be found. A person who also has CCR5 mutation, and most of such people, about 1% of the people are there in the world, both of whose parents had CCR5 mutation, and about 20% in the people are those one of whose parents had CCR5 mutation in the gene, and most of them are Caucasians. and therefore ensuring that there is a stem cell transplant facility available for all the people is not possible as of now, because most of the cases for HIV, they are in the African continent, and there the CCR5 mutation, that is not as much there. And also the stem cell therapy as a cure for HIV involves chemotherapy and the immunosuppression, and even after such procedures there is no guaranteed success, the virus can come back also. This infographic also tells in brief how stem cell therapy is used, that the donor cells are extracted through the blood and the resistant stem cells are filtered and collected. They are injected into the patient, and a few transplanted stem cells, they grow into thousands more immune cells. Thank you.